you very much, Peter. Delighted to be here. You mentioned earlier on that there's a lot of attention being placed on experts. Of course, you know the definition of an expert. It is somebody who by accident happens to answer 2 consecutive questions correctly. And the definition of a specialist is somebody who, again by accident, answers 3 consecutive questions correctly. And of course, a policy consultant employs experts and specialists. So we're all in that community. What inspired me to do this paper was we published a book on how to tender for buyers and for suppliers. We published this in August, which is basically a textbook on how to do the business. But that challenged me to look at the public procurement industry in Ireland to say, is it actually cost effective? And that's the topic of my conversation. I've also got hard copies of the presentation for those of you who'd like to get the hard copy. It's a big market. 85 billion euros, and that's a very low estimate to my mind, will be procured over the next 5 years in Ireland, and probably 15 billion in Northern Ireland. So we're talking at a marketplace of 100 billion euros. Now, if I was a company and was buying 100 billion euros, I'd probably be talking about it quite a lot in the papers and trying to generate interest in it. But the reality is this is an industry that's going on, in a way, behind closed doors and way under the radar. Procurement, just for definition purposes, is when a government agency or a private sector puts something out, supplies, works or goods, and the tendering effort is what the private sector does in response. The reality is that everything has to be procured, with some defence and security exceptions, regardless of the value. So even small bids under 5,000 euros have to be procured. And this is the figure for the public sector. I've no idea, haven't yet got into how much is procured in the private sector. The public sector is rules-based, the private sector is value-based. So, as we are experts, the first thing you do is look to the evidence. I spent a lot of time trying to track evidence based on research in Ireland, and I couldn't find a lot. There's very, very little academic research done in the space of public procurement. There's probably, as a consequence, an opportunity there for people to make a name for themselves. And the evidence that you could find couldn't, through any stretch of the imagination, find out a cause-effect of procurement and the dynamic impact on the economy. And that's the reason I changed the title of the presentation. The data, the very basic data that you need to do this sort of research, isn't available. I'm aware of one particular parliamentary question that was put into the system very recently looking for this basic data, and the Office of Government Procurement, who are the agency responsible for the data, can't provide it. So as a consequence, we don't know the total value of the public procurement market in Ireland, broken down by different categories of contracting authorities. I've never found, and nobody can produce a statistic to say, how much do commercial semi-state companies procure every year. Nobody knows that. We know what's in the public capital programme because it's published. We don't know, for example, how much low-value tenders are published. Nobody knows. So it's very difficult to do the research. We can't get the statistics. We don't know the split between works, supplies and services. We don't know the split as to what type of companies win. SMEs, small businesses, micro business, and they're all different. So we also don't know how many bids are submitted per tender. This is all fairly basic stuff to build up a picture, but none of it's available. So there are serious gaps in the research literature, and I would argue that the Office of Government Procurement, as the agency with responsibility for procurement, should really try to do something about it. The market in Europe is 1.9 trillion euros a year. So this is fairly significant stuff if you're an exporter. In Ireland, 9% of GDP is procured publicly, which is again is very significant. The public capital programme is worth in the region of 7.6 billion since October. So that is a very significant component of about the 18 billion euro spend. The EU rules are that you must respect certain principles, and it's a rules-based system, but under certain thresholds, and for consultancy generally it's 135,000 euros, the rules are totally and utterly flexible. You have to take account of what Brussels wants, but they do not set prescriptive rules. So there's quite a degree of flexibility available to set the rules within the lower value tenders, which I'm going to come back to. It doesn't happen. As you do, again, to get the evidence, you survey. And we've surveyed our clients in bid management services. I'm not going to throw too many statistics at you, but there are some very, very interesting feedback. About 140 clients responded to this. Only 1 in 4 actually bid exclusively into the private sector. So it's a huge amount of companies are bidding generally because that's the way they get a lot of market share. Their hit rate is about 1 in 4. So you lose 3 bids out of 4. 73% didn't understand what the Office of Government Procurement was about. Very high figure. 87% had never heard of things like green public procurement. Nearly 80% were not aware that the new EU directives were adopted in Ireland last April and had to be implemented. 80%. And nearly again 80% had issues with understanding the Office of Government Procurement's guidance. So it tells me there are serious communications issues here in this 85 billion euro marketplace. And the Office of Government Procurement, from the surveying, would really need to up their game in relation to communications. The trend is to issue tenders for framework agreements, and for the uninitiated, that basically means the appointing of panels over 3 to 4 years. If you're looking for legal services now, there are panels for this, and 8 to 10 companies are shortlisted. And if there's a requirement, you go to the panel and you get your preferred bidder. But putting frameworks agreements in place is a very, very expensive business. Now, that's the figure that the European Commission has of 17.6 bids. It could be 3 to 4 times that. And every bid costs €7,500 on average. So it's costing about €250,000 to put a framework agreement up. And that excludes the costs involved when a supplier has to bid to a frame or to a particular tender. So in Northern Ireland, they've more or less abandoned framework agreements because it's not cost effective. Here is quite the contrary. We're pushing framework agreements for everything and for very low value tenders. And to my mind, any tender below the value of the EU threshold, which is 135,000, shouldn't really go into a framework agreement. The good news for the private sector is that framework agreements are phenomenally price competitive. So if you're bidding, for example, legal services, and you're asked to bid in a mini competition, you probably will drop your prices by 20, 30, 40% to get the work. So it's great news for the public sector. There are very significant savings happening. But again, in this area, there are no statistics available about the number of framework competitions, the drawdown rates, and the resulting savings. There is one report available. The Office of Government Procurement for the second year has produced, it's called Spending Analysis. It was published with great fanfare and very positive. The key message was that SMEs are winning 95% of all the tenders, whereas 99.9% of the companies in the country are SMEs. That doesn't tell you a lot. If you break it down to small business and micro businesses, they don't have the statistics, which is quite extraordinary. And the survey only covers what the Office of Government Procurement is responsible for. It only covers about a quarter of the total amount being procured. So it's a good piece of work, but it's not telling the full picture. And again, the key issue is you can't get the data. And as a consequence, there are no meaningful insights, and everyone thinking that Irish small firms are doing well probably are being misled. Our clients bellyache all the time about the cost of bidding, and we charge consultancy fees to help them bid, and we're very, very good value, that I should add. But the cost of bidding is a big issue at European level, and it's been studied at European level, and it critically depends on the number of bids per tender, and that in turn depends on how things are procured. So the more complicated the tendering, the more work is required. The costs are enormous. I reckon, based on the statistics that we've looked at that are available, that over the next 5 years between the private sector and the public sector, it will cost at least 1.6 billion euros to run tender competitions and to respond to tender competitions. The cost of tendering in Ireland, according to the European Commission, is at least 30% more expensive than it is in other countries. And this issue has never been brought to the public domain before. You're word exclusive, you're hearing about it here for the first time. But that's a huge amount of cost. And you have to say to yourself, is that an efficient use of the public sector's time? And more particularly, is it an efficient use of the private sector's time? Because companies are being asked to bid and submit very, very complicated documents, whereas the government have the option of simplifying, greater simplification, put everything online, and as a consequence, costs would drop dramatically. And that's one of the recommendations I'm going to come to. Another issue is win rates. And again, statistics, a bit like hen's teeth in this area, you can't get many of them. It's very difficult to find out precisely what the win rates are across sectors. But what is clear from the assessments that have been carried out for the European Commission, that any contract, say over 300,000 euros, is absolutely out of scope for small firms. So if you don't put lots or break down tenders into lots, it is incredibly difficult for a micro business, even within a consortium, to win a contract. Now, there is a trend to break contracts down into lots, but I would argue that it's nowhere near as dramatic as it should be if Irish small firms are to win more business. And the winning of business by small firms is also directly linked to another issue, which I call contract leakage. This is the volume of Irish taxpayers funded contracts that go outside the jurisdiction. Now, again, to try and get statistics on this is incredibly difficult. Some figures say it could be or was as high as 16, 17, 18%, but I've taken the lower figure of about 11%. So 11% of the value of Irish procurement goes outside the jurisdiction. And that's around 9 billion euros, potentially in funding that the Irish taxpayer has spent will go to contracts not registered in Ireland. Now think about that. In other European countries, the figure is as low as 0.2%. The EU average is around 3%. So our contract leakage is nearly 4 times higher than the EU average. And as a consequence, the Exchequer will lose, and again it's a conservative estimate, at least 2 billion in taxation because we're giving contracts outside the jurisdiction. And it's also going to lose the potential of creating and sustaining jobs, around 4,000 jobs. This, again, has not been raised as a public policy issue. We are a small open economy. We do not have heavy manufacturing, and there will never be a situation where we will have every contract staying within the Irish economy. But there's nothing in play to say that we should be trying to get our procurement kept in the Irish economy around the figure of 3%, which would seem to be the European average. A certain consultancy house, who shall remain nameless, indicated to government several years ago that very significant savings could be achieved by smarter procurement. They didn't provide any evidence for the figure, hence I won't mention the company's name, but there will be savings of around 500 million, primarily in the area of professional services. Now, we're now into year 4, and only 150 million of that 500 million has actually been achieved. And you have to ask yourself, if there are savings, who captures the savings? Are they being passed on to us as consumers, or are they being captured within the organisations that make the savings? So if a local authority saves its legal services bill by 150,000 euros, does it reduce the rates base by 150,000 euros, or does it just divert that funding to another part of its services portfolio? We don't know because statistics aren't available, but I'm sure we'll find out. Most government agencies are subject to Oireachtas oversight, and procurement is no different. There have been many cases, which I've mentioned in the paper, where the Public Accounts Committee in particular has had many presentations made about faults and flaws. And I think the biggest issue emerged in my research is that the HSE is and has been found on foot of a Controller and Auditor General's report of guilty of advertising tenders, awarding contracts without advertising tenders. Now that's not corruption, that's just bad practice. And you might say it's not important, but in other countries they actually quantify the degree to which tenders or businesses awarded without going to tender. And it is a big issue in Ireland. And I said to myself, I wonder how big it is till I got the Sunday Business Post yesterday. As you probably saw, the very top front page headline is all about awarding contracts and giving funding to organisations that don't tender. And that's a bit of a problem in some parts of the Irish economy. So the Oireachtas looks at this, but the Office of Government Procurement, because it's not a statutory agency, don't produce an annual report to the Oireachtas. They're not subject to scrutiny by the Public Accounts Committee unless there's an issue. So the Oireachtas, probably given the fact that there's 85 billion euros of our money being procured, probably needs to take a higher degree of interest in the whole area of procurement. Part of the problem is there's near, as I said at the outset, total silence about procurement. Everyone sees this as a problem. You see a tender coming out and you worry yourself writing the tender, and that's the preoccupation. And the public sector getting the tenders out and getting them out correctly is the preoccupation. But nobody's stepping back to say, on the island of Ireland, there's 100 billion euros, minimum of 100 billion euros being procured, and nobody is talking about how it can be done much more efficiently, and whether, in spending all this money, we can actually capture far more revenue in the Irish economy and give more work to small businesses. 5 minutes. As you know, one of my pet subjects are regulatory impact assessments. I've researched and written quite a bit of work. So obviously, again, trying to get the evidence, I went into the relevant websites, and it is a cabinet requirement that once an EU directive is proposed, a regulatory impact assessment should be carried out. And the European Commission carried out a comprehensive regulatory impact assessment about 2012 when these new EU directives dating on 2014 were adopted. In fairness, the Office of Government Procurement went out to public consultation in line with our earlier theme and got lots of submissions. But they've never produced a regulatory impact assessment. So we're actually implementing the very complicated directives to rule this 85 billion euros worth of spend, and nobody has actually worked out whether it's been done on a cost-efficient basis and what the cost effectiveness might be of looking at option A or B or C and how it impacts on the economy, and to answer the theme of the question I was supposed to look at, whether procurement could actually be used as an economic driver, particularly outside the Dublin area, particularly to generate business into local communities. Never happened. It's not going to happen. And with apologies to Sean, I've actually got my slide on Brexit. My instinct is, I won't go into the big Brexit story, because procurement is a critical part of the single market, and if a deal is done, an EEA type deal or whatever, the UK and Northern Ireland will probably adopt the EU procurement directives, which basically means nothing much is going to change. They have very sophisticated guidelines in Northern Ireland, for example, that we're familiar with, and I don't see these guidelines changing anytime soon. So in a post-Brexit scenario, the EU rules actually bring huge efficiencies to bear in the UK and Northern Ireland, so I don't see much happening. But another area of interest is, can procurement be used to advance other policy areas? And again, the research I've done shows a lot of effort has been done, but not much is happening. For example, the whole area of green public procurement. There is a report on green public procurement. Have government guidelines been issued on green public procurement? No. Has training been carried out by public servants to tell them what it all means and how they embed green credentials in tender bids? No. Are we the only country in Europe that doesn't have a highly active green public procurement market? Yeah. Are we doing something on innovation that all other member states have, including the Small Business Innovation Initiative? We're starting. EI have a budget of, I think it's €1 million, and €1 million against an 85 billion spend doesn't even get you to first base. Also, procurement in other countries is used to require contractors to employ locally based employees. Is it happening in Ireland? It is, but on a voluntary basis. You cannot impose mandatory conditions about employing people. But again, a framework could be put together to encourage major contractors to employ local contractors. So we're not really using the leverage effect of procurement to drive public policy objectives. Other countries do it. We're starting, but we're not really pushing it as much as it should. The Office of Government Procurement has been assessed, as indeed have all other major procuring agencies, about their performance, and we rank very highly. Procurement in Ireland is managed very efficiently through the Office of Government Procurement. It's all rules-based. The web systems that are supporting it are very efficient. We've got centralised expertise. The Office of Government Procurement is a centre of excellence, and I would say that for the record it is top class. It's doing the business very, very well. But we should argue, should we be looking at moving beyond the single market scorecard? Is there, as I call, room for improvement? And at the European Commission level, they've identified, yes, there's a need to improve procurement skills outside the Office of Government Procurement, and more use should be made of template documents, and particularly more use should be made of templates that encourage small firm success. So I've come up with a few little ideas, and I'll probably be taken off the Christmas card list in certain government departments for making these ideas. I would argue, based on what you've heard me say and what's in the paper, there is a need to set up the Office of Government Procurement as a statutory agency. It is at the moment within the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. I would even go as far as to say perhaps its remit should be that of a regulator. The commercial semi-state bodies here ignore the Office of Government Procurement. They do their own thing. We've 14 or 20, whatever it is, commercial semi-state companies. They basically do not comply with what is considered to be best practice. But if you had the OGP as a statutory body that could give ministerial instruction to companies to do X, Y, and Z, that will improve matters. The OGP itself absolutely needs to invest in communications. The lack of research in this area is surprising, and certainly while some measure has been done in terms of in-house in training, I would argue you could spend €500,000 in training in the public sector and the private sector, and you wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface. At the moment, the government spend on training is around €70,000 for a spend potentially of 85 billion, which basically means it's not good enough. In other countries, every single major body that has public spending of, say, over €10 million a year would be asked to produce what's called a public procurement plan. So in other words, if Trinity was spending 15 to 20 million, which it would easily on supplies, goods, works and whatever, they would publish a plan that would say over the next 3 years, this is broadly speaking what we're seeking to procure. You put that into the market, you engage with your suppliers, they tell you what can be done, and when you do eventually get to procuring, you've had a dialogue and you're probably getting much more informed bids, and you're probably getting a much better idea as to what the market can deliver as distinct from what you think the market can deliver. Perhaps the most controversial idea I have is that to help small businesses, and I'm leaving the SME lot aside, that the way the tenders are structured at the moment needs to be radically changed. At the moment, everything under €25,000 is not advertised. I would argue that government should basically not award any contracts to any non-Irish companies below the EU threshold, which is 135,000. So what you would do effectively you wouldn't advertise any contracts in Ireland over 135,000. That's what the Austrians do. No Austrian company or no non-Austrian company wins government contracts below 135,000. And so the firms in Ireland would register on e-tenders. So if there was a requirement for paper clips, all the companies that register for paper clips would get a copy of the tender, and only they would get a copy of the tender. So you can actually manage through e-tenders how Irish companies could bid for their subsectors or how their consortium might be bid. Now, I haven't shared this with ISME or the small firms or chambers, and they're very keen to capture as much work within the Irish economy, and that would help. There is a new system called the dynamic purchasing system. I won't go into it, it's in the paper. This is the cheapest, lowest cost, easiest way to procure standard routine goods services. I think there are only 3 of these procurements in play at the moment. There should be 300. Last slide. Guidance needs to be published. This is a rule-based system. The new EU directives have been implemented since last April, and the government hasn't produced one line of revised guidance to tell buyers, their own civil servants and public servants, and indeed the poor suppliers that we look after, as to what is required. And that's not good news. There's also a requirement, which happens again in other countries, to have what's called an independent mediator or an appeals body. You lose a tender, and in other countries you go to an independent appeals body and you argue with them and you make your case, and then they talk to the procurer, the buyer, and then a decision is taken. Here you have to go to the High Court. So unless you have 50,000 euros in your back pocket, you cannot appeal a tender decision, which is again extremely anti-SME or very anti-small business. So there is scope, and there's precedent in other countries to facilitate the appeal of decisions on legal grounds. I would also argue we should reduce our leakage rate to about the EU average. I mentioned that already. And certainly putting in smarter, slicker, more transparent tendering systems will has the potential to dramatically reduce transaction costs, which are, as in Ireland, at least 30% higher than in other countries. And there's a need to invest in training. So what I was researching all of that, so what's my big bang message? We really do need it's not for me to do it, but we do need somebody to step back from all of this when they get the data, to do a value for money review of procurement in Ireland. It hasn't been done. It's long overdue, and if it's the main rationale for it will be, how are we going to spend this 85 billion? Is it going to be done correctly, properly, and to have an impact, dynamic impact on local economies and on local business? So thank you very much, and I'll leave that.